Maria Alvarez had lived in the little town of Clearwater for almost 5 years. When she first arrived with her husband, Daniel, they were full of dreams. Clearwater was a quiet, green place surrounded by wide fields, dusty roads, and houses with white fences. People greeted each other at the local store and shared stories at the church on Sundays. Back then, Maria believed this small town would be her forever home. She was young, just 26, and carried the warmth of someone who still believed the world was kind. Her husband worked as a truck driver, and she took care of their small farmhouse on the edge of town. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. She loved waking up early, feeding the chickens, watering the small vegetable garden, and waiting for Daniel to come home with his tired but smiling face. But everything changed one rainy night. Daniel was driving back home from a delivery when his truck slid on the wet road. The accident happened so suddenly that no one saw it coming. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Maria's world broke that night. She sat outside the hospital, clutching Daniel's jacket like it was the only thing keeping her alive. In that moment, the warm, familiar world around her turned cold. In the days that followed, the people of Clearwater came to her house. At first, they brought flowers and food. They offered soft words of sympathy. But slowly, as weeks turned into months, their faces changed. Their whispers started. It began with small comments she could hear behind her back. She's too young to have lost her husband. Bad luck follows her. Strange things always happen around her. It was a small town, and in small towns stories grew quickly. Some said her husband's death was a curse. Others said she brought misfortune. She didn't understand why they said such things, but she soon realized that in their minds, being a young widow was something to fear, or worse, to avoid. People began to distance themselves. When she walked to the grocery store, the owner greeted everyone but her. Children, who once waved at her, now hid behind their mothers. If she tried to speak, people looked down, pretending not to hear. The church pew that used to be full around her was now always empty. No one wanted to sit too close. Her days became quiet but not peaceful. She woke up early, fed the chickens, watered the garden, and fixed things around the farm. But no one visited anymore. The house felt too big. The silence inside it was heavy, pressing down on her chest every night. The worst part wasn't just being alone. It was how people treated her like she was invisible, or worse, unwanted. One afternoon, she stood in line at the bakery, holding a few coins for bread. When it was her turn, the woman behind the counter suddenly said, "We're out of bread." But Maria could see the loaves right there on the shelf. She didn't argue. She just walked out with empty hands and a heavy heart. She often reminded herself not to cry in public. She would keep her tears for the quiet hours after sunset when no one could see her. But the whispers didn't stop. One night, as she sat on her porch, she heard two men passing by. They didn't see her sitting there in the dark. "She's cursed," one said. "Since her husband died, nothing good's happened in this town. She should just leave," the other replied. "Maybe things will get better once she's gone." Maria wrapped her arms around herself and closed her eyes. She wanted to disappear, but the small farm was all she had left. She couldn't leave the home she built with Daniel. It was the only piece of her old life still standing. Then came the vandalism. At first, it was just someone throwing rocks at her gate at night. Then one morning, she woke to find the wooden fence broken. Her small chicken coop had been kicked open, and the chickens were scattered. She spent hours fixing the fence alone, her hands shaking not from fear, but from the pain of being treated like she didn't belong in the very place she called home. That same week, she went to the town council office to pay her property tax. As she stood in line, a woman whispered loudly to another, "I don't even know why she's still here." Another added, "If she leaves, maybe we'll finally have some peace." Maria kept her head down. She paid what she needed to pay and walked out quietly. The sun was hot that day, but her hands felt cold. Her landlord wasn't kind either. He owned several small farms around town and liked to feel powerful. One day, he knocked on her door with a long face. "You're behind on payment," he said. "I just need a little more time," she replied softly. He frowned. "This place brings me bad luck. I don't want trouble. If things don't change, I might have to give this land to someone else." She nodded. She had heard this tone before, not just from him, but from others. It was the same cold tone of someone who had already decided she didn't matter. But Maria was stronger than people thought. Even though the world seemed against her, she never let her shoulders bend. Every morning she woke up and faced the day. She took care of the house and the farm, repaired fences, and sold eggs at the small market. Some buyers ignored her table, but a few kind strangers bought without a word. Even a single small sale made her feel less forgotten. One late evening after a long, tiring day, Maria was closing her gate when she saw something strange. A group of boys from the town standing at the end of her property. They were laughing and throwing small stones toward her fence. She froze. She didn't want trouble, but she couldn't just let them destroy what little she had. "Stop, please," she called softly. The boys laughed louder. One kicked the gate, another climbed on the fence, trying to break it further. She felt her heart beating fast, and then a strong voice cut through the night. "Enough." The laughter stopped immediately. It was Sheriff James Porter. James was not like the others. He had lived in Clearwater for many years. Tall, calm, and known for his quiet fairness, he didn't often raise his voice, but when he did, people listened. The boys stepped back, suddenly unsure of themselves. "Go home," James said firmly. "Now." The boys mumbled something and ran down the road. Maria stood still, her hands gripping the gate. She didn't know whether to thank him or just hide behind the door. James walked closer, his steps slow so she wouldn't feel threatened. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. "Yes," she whispered. Her voice was shaky but steady enough. He looked at the broken fence and sighed. "This isn't the first time, is it?" Maria shook her head. James knelt down and examined the broken part of the fence like it was his own. He didn't ask more questions. He didn't look at her with pity, which surprised her. Most people either ignored her or stared at her like she was something strange. But James looked at her like she was just a person. "I'll fix this tomorrow," he said simply. "You don't have to," she replied quickly. She wasn't used to anyone offering help. "I know I don't have to," James said with a small smile. "But I will." For the first time in a long while, Maria felt something other than fear or sadness. She felt seen. Not judged. Not whispered about. Just seen. The next morning, when she opened her door, James was already there with his toolkit. He worked quietly, fixing the fence piece by piece. Maria stood nearby, holding the extra wood planks. They didn't talk much. The silence between them wasn't heavy like before. It was warm, gentle, like the soft sun after a storm. As the days passed, Maria began to notice small things. James often stopped by after his rounds in town. Sometimes he brought her extra supplies she couldn't afford. Sometimes he just sat on the porch and talked about ordinary things. About the weather, about the town, about the new plants growing near the river. People in town started noticing too. They whispered again, but this time their whispers were different. Some were surprised, some confused. A few were even upset, but James didn't seem to care, and slowly Maria began to care less too. She didn't know it then. But that night when James told the boys to leave would become the beginning of a quiet change in her life. She didn't know that the same town that had turned its back on her would one day have to face the strength she had carried all along. For now, all she knew was that someone had finally stood beside her. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And for a woman who had been called cursed, humiliated, and left alone, that simple act of kindness felt like sunlight after a long, cold winter. The days that followed slowly began to feel different for Maria. She still woke up early, fed the chickens, and worked on the small farm. But now she didn't feel as invisible as before. Every morning when she opened her door, she half expected to see James Porter, the town sheriff, walking down the path to check on the fence or bring her something she might need. He never treated her with pity. He spoke to her as if she mattered, as if her voice was worth hearing. Sometimes he would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee in his hand, talking about the things happening around town. He told her small stories about the people he met, about how the old Miller barn had a new roof or how the wildflowers were starting to bloom on the hill. Maria listened. She rarely spoke much, but she liked the sound of his voice. It was steady, calm, and warm. It made the silence of the farm softer, but the rest of the town wasn't so kind. When people saw James spending time at her house, whispers started again. "Why is the sheriff with her?" some said. "He should stay away from her bad luck," others added. People who once ignored her now stared at her from a distance with confused faces. Some were simply surprised, while others didn't like what they saw. Maria knew about the whispers. She could feel their eyes following her when she walked to town. She heard the quiet laughter behind her back. But she didn't lower her head anymore. She held it a little higher now. James had unknowingly given her something precious: courage. One morning, Maria went to the market to sell eggs as she did every week. Usually people avoided her stall, but this time James was walking beside her. The moment they arrived, the quiet market seemed to grow louder. People who never spoke to her suddenly pretended to be busy with their baskets. A few women gave her cold looks. One man raised his eyebrows in disbelief, but James didn't seem to notice, or maybe he noticed but didn't care. He picked up a basket from her stall and smiled at one of the customers. "Best eggs in Clearwater," he said in a calm, strong voice. The woman who had been hesitating to buy looked at Maria, then at James, and slowly nodded. "All right," she said, handing over the coins. Maria's hands shook as she took the money. It wasn't just a sale. It was the first time in months someone had bought from her without turning away. After that, more people came. Not all, but a few. Some were just curious because the sheriff was standing there. Others wanted to talk to him. But whatever the reason, Maria's eggs were sold out that day for the first time since Daniel's death. That evening, Maria sat on the porch with James. The sky was painted with the soft colors of sunset. She wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small for what she truly felt. "You don't have to keep doing this," she said softly. "Doing what?" James asked, standing by me. James leaned back in his chair. "I'm not standing by you. I'm standing with you," he said with a gentle smile. His words settled deep in her heart like a warm blanket. As weeks passed, the whispers in town grew louder. Some people didn't like change. They had gotten used to treating her like she didn't matter, and now they didn't know how to act. But there were also others, quiet ones, who started to see her differently. They saw the woman who worked hard every day, who didn't give up even when the world turned its back. They saw the sheriff beside her, unshaken by their judgment. Then one afternoon, something happened that changed everything. The town council held its monthly meeting at the old community hall. Usually Maria never went to those meetings. People didn't want her there, and she didn't want to face their stares. But this time a notice arrived at her door. The council wanted to discuss her land. Her hands trembled when she read it. She walked into the hall that evening with quiet steps. People turned their heads the moment she entered. The room was full of familiar faces, the same ones who had whispered about her for months. Her landlord was there too, sitting near the front, looking serious. James was already there. When he saw her, he gave her a small nod of reassurance. She took a seat in the back, her heart beating fast. The head of the council cleared his throat. "This land on the edge of town," he said, glancing at a piece of paper. "It has not brought much benefit to Clearwater, and it seems to carry certain problems." There were quiet murmurs in the room. Everyone knew who he was talking about. He continued, "Some of the townsfolk have expressed concern. They believe this land could be used better, perhaps by someone else. Someone who won't bring trouble." Maria lowered her eyes. The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. Before she could gather the courage to speak, James stood up. His chair made a soft sound on the wooden floor and the room went silent. "This isn't about the land," he said in a firm voice. "It's about a woman who has done nothing wrong. A woman who lost someone she loved. And instead of helping her, this town turned its back on her." Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. James looked around the room. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "We talk about community. We talk about kindness. But where was that kindness when Maria needed it? She pays her taxes. She works hard every single day. She harms no one. So why are we trying to take away the only thing she has left?" No one answered. Maria's landlord finally spoke. "She brings bad luck. Everyone knows it." James looked at him with calm, steady eyes. "No one brings bad luck. That's just a story people tell when they don't want to face their own fear. She's not cursed. She's brave, braver than most in this room." Maria felt tears welling in her eyes. No one had ever spoken for her like that before. After a long silence, the head of the council sighed. "This matter will not continue. She keeps her land." Meeting adjourned. Maria walked out of that hall with her heart pounding. James walked beside her, not saying anything. He didn't need to. His actions had said everything. The next morning, she found a basket on her porch. Inside were fresh apples and a note that read, "We're sorry. It wasn't signed, but she knew it was from one of the townspeople. The whispers didn't stop completely, but they changed. Some were softer now. Some people greeted her again awkwardly, but it was a start. And Maria, who had spent so many months alone, began to see little signs of kindness return to her life. Then came the day that no one expected. The town held its annual fair. It was the one time of year when everyone came together, no matter who they were. Maria had not attended since Daniel's passing, but this year James asked her to come. "I'll be there," he said with a smile, "and so will you." She hesitated but finally agreed. When she arrived at the fair, dressed in a simple blue dress, people turned to look at her. She felt the old fear return for a moment. But then she saw James walking toward her. He reached out his hand, not in secret but in front of everyone. She placed her hand in his. The music played. Laughter filled the air. And for the first time in a long time, Maria felt like she was a part of something again. James guided her to the small wooden stage where the mayor was speaking. Then, in front of everyone, he did something that silenced the entire fair. He looked at her with calm eyes and said, "Maria, you've been strong when no one stood by you. But from now on, you'll never stand alone again. If you'll let me, I want to give you my name, not to save you, but to walk beside you as your partner, your family." The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Maria's hands trembled. She had lived so long being shunned, humiliated, and pushed aside that she had forgotten what it felt like to be chosen, not out of pity, but out of respect. Tears rolled down her cheeks, not of sadness, but of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The people who once mocked her now stood speechless. Some lowered their eyes in shame. Some even clapped softly. Maria nodded slowly, her heart full. "Yes," she whispered. James gently held her hand, and in that moment, the woman they had once called cursed became Maria Porter. The sheriff's wife, yes, but more than that, a woman who had faced cruelty and never lost her quiet strength. From that day forward, everything changed. People began to greet her again. Children who once hid behind their mothers now waved at her with smiles. The bakery woman who had once turned her away now saved her a loaf each morning. Maria didn't forget the pain she had gone through. She carried it with her, but not as a wound, more like a reminder of how far she had come, and every evening, when the sun set behind the fields, she sat on the porch beside James, holding his hand, feeling the gentle breeze on her face. The same town that had humiliated her now spoke her name with respect, and Maria Porter, once called Cursed, had written a new story. One built not on fear but on quiet courage and love that refused to be shaken.